5 months ago, PSG were almost European champions.
Give it away. Here's a chance for Mbappe, who's looking to find room, and then Herrera. Mbappe straight at Neuer. What an opportunity wasted by Paris Saint-Germain after a terrible Bayern Munich mistake.
Again, it's fallen for the right people for Paris Saint-Germain. You've had Neymar, you've had Di Maria, and now you've just had Mbappe.
However, due to some close misses, PSG and their manager, Thomas Tuchel, went home empty-handed. Despite taking the Parisians further in Europe than they'd ever been before, Tuchel is now out of a job. To replace him, this past week, PSG hired ex-Tottenham manager Mauricio Pochettino. Today we ask, why did PSG fire Tuchel, and what does Pochettino's hiring mean for the club? How would you characterize Tuchel's time at PSG?
Well, it was broadly successful.
Tom Williams is a football writer and broadcaster who contributes to The Times, Canal Plus, and The Totally Football Show.
He won back-to-back league titles. There was a domestic treble last season. He's the first coach to ever take PSG to a Champions League final, so he broke new ground there. But there were big disappointments too. There was the elimination by Manchester United in the Champions League in 2019, which was seen as a big humiliation for PSG. They failed to win both domestic cup competitions that season, losing to Rennes in the Coupe de France final notably. And he failed to give PSG a coherent playing identity. And I think that was probably his biggest failing overall.
Now, PSG fired Tuchel despite reaching the finals of the Champions League 4 months ago, which you just referenced. For those who haven't followed Ligue 1 this season, what's happened this year with PSG, and why is he just being fired now?
So the difficulty PSG had at the beginning of the season was that there was a very quick turnaround between the end of the previous season and their appearance in the Champions League final and the beginning of the current season. They basically had just over 2 weeks between losing to Bayern Munich in Lisbon and opening their domestic campaign. They lost their first 2 matches away at Lens and at home to Marseille, which is pretty unprecedented in the sort of modern PSG era. But the feeling was at the time that, this is a team that's had no kind of pre-season. Players are knackered after the Champions League. There'd been a COVID-19 outbreak at the club. There were various injuries. So they were kind of written off in a way. PSG, they went on a great run of matches, but have since sort of hit the skids again a little bit. They lost away at Monaco, despite being 2-0 up, losing 3-2. They lost at home to Lyon for the first time in 2007. They've already lost 4 matches in Ligue 1 this season, which is only 1 match less than in the entirety of last season, albeit last season was a truncated campaign. And they qualified in the Champions League, albeit having lost 2 of their first 3 matches. So it was a bit of a patchy campaign already. And when the winter break began in Ligue 1, they were only 3rd in the table behind Lille and Lyon, although it is quite close at the top of the table. In terms of the timing of his sacking, it echoed the sacking of Antoine Kombouaré, who was the first coach of the Qatari era at PSG. He was the coach inherited from the previous regime. He was sacked December the 22nd, 2011, so a few days before Christmas. And in this case, Tuchel, the confirmation of his dismissal didn't arrive until after Christmas, but the news broke that he'd been dismissed on Christmas Eve. And I think it's a reflection both of the fact that things weren't going brilliantly this season. There have been various sort of tensions behind the scenes in addition to the difficulties on the pitch. But I think above all, it reflects a knowledge at PSG that if they wanted to appoint Mauricio Pochettino as Tuchel's successor, which is what looks like is going to happen, they needed to act quickly because he wasn't going to be on the market forever.
You mentioned some of the off-the-field issues a moment ago. What were those?
So there were tensions between Tuchel and Leonardo, the sporting director, most notably, particularly in terms of recruitment. Tuchel had a say in recruitment and had on occasion succeeded in getting the club to recruit players that he wanted, but Leonardo was in charge. And there was a pretty significant amount of upheaval during the last summer transfer window. Lots of big name experienced players moving on, people like Thiago Silva and Edinson Cavani and Thomas Müller. And as the transfer window was coming to a close, PSG hadn't yet signed their replacements. And Thomas Tuchel spoke out, was quite critical of the fact that the club hadn't yet brought in new players and was publicly sort of told that he'd spoken out of turn by Leonardo. And then more recently, Tuchel gave an interview to Sport One, the German media organisation, in which he sort of complained about the extent to which he was exposed at PSG. The only figurehead of the club, constantly having to answer questions about minor controversies behind the scenes, and I think that didn't go down all that well behind the scenes at PSG. And Tuchel is quite a straight talking guy. I think that's one of the things that makes him, gives him an appeal as a coach. He gives straight answers. He's not afraid to express an opinion. But PR is very important at PSG, and I think there was a feeling that he had crossed the line perhaps one time too many, allied to the fact that results had been patchy over the first half of the season, plus the fact that Mauricio Pochettino was available. I think all those factors conspired to leave his head on the chopping block, as it were.
What has been the reaction in France to this firing? Are fans upset or are they happy?
There was surprise at the timing of it, particularly because it wasn't leaked to the press, in the sense that there was no speculation about Tuchel's future. There's no significant speculation about his future. He was out of contract at the end of this season, and it was basically an open secret that his contract would not be extended, because of these tensions between himself and Leonardo primarily, and also the fact that, there was a sense that the team perhaps wasn't quite, where it should be. But no one saw him being sacked when he was. The news just came out of nowhere on Christmas Eve. It was the front pages of L'Equipe on Christmas Day. So that was a surprise. I don't think his departure has been mourned necessarily by PSG fans. They're grateful to him, notably for having led the club to its first Champions League final, for having won all the trophies that he won. But I don't sense that there was any great affection for him. And it's been notable that there hasn't been a huge public reaction from the players. Kylian Mbappe posted something on an Instagram story. But apart from that, there hasn't been a huge amount in terms of, players wishing to thank him for his work with them. Perhaps that was because it took a few days for his dismissal to be officially confirmed. So, there was surprise at the timing, and also because it felt like it came out of the blue. But very quickly, I think there was a sense of, he was almost a dead man walking, in the sense that everyone knew his contract wasn't going to be extended beyond the end of the season. And given that the winter break in France provides a natural opportunity to sort of review things and make changes, and the apparent eagerness of the club to bring in Pochettino as his successor, I think that once that initial surprise had passed, people thought, actually, perhaps we should have seen this coming.
From a big picture point of view, what were some of the main issues that Tuchel had during his reign that need to be addressed in the next reign by Pochettino?
I think ultimately it boils down to this issue of the team's playing identity, because this is something that a succession of coaches have failed to create, and it was something that Tuchel was hired to instill, and something that he didn't really get to grips with. Just to give you a sort of a brief modern history of PSG coaches in the Qatari era, Carlo Ancelotti was the first superstar coach. He arrived mid-season in 2011-12. Wasn't there for a huge amount of time, but he turned PSG into this quite compact, quite reactive team who played on the counter-attack quite a lot. And he gave the club a sort of professionalism and a winning spirit that wasn't really there before. He won the first title of the current regime. Then Laurent Blanc arrives. He was there for 3 years, and I think he's been the most influential coach in terms of PSG's playing style, because very quickly he decided he wanted PSG to become a possession team. One of the first things he did was change the system to a 4-3-3. He had Zlatan Ibrahimovic up front. He moved Cavani onto one of the wings, and PSG were a team who dominated their matches completely, won every domestic trophy there was, struggled to transfer that way of playing and that way of winning to the Champions League. And that ultimately is why he lost his job. Unai Emery, who was appointed in 2016, he wanted to make PSG a much more vertical, much more aggressive team. And he had some success with that, most notably the first leg victory against Barcelona, the Champions League last 16 in early 2017, where PSG won 4-0. An absolute tactical masterclass. You could really see what he was trying to do with the team. Unfortunately, a few weeks later, PSG collapse at Camp Nou and lose 6-1, and it's sort of the greatest humiliation in the club's history. And that calls Emery's methods into question. And at the same time, the players had already expressed resistance to this new style of play. And this happened quite early on in Emery's tenure. They didn't like playing with this sort of relentless verticality, the pressing, the quick transitions. They preferred the way they'd been used to playing under Laurent Blanc, which was as a possession team. So they ended up, Emery's PSG became a bit of a fudge tactically. And a similar thing happened with Thomas Tuchel. He came in 2018 with his reputation as a great innovator, particularly tactically. And there was, we saw some of those innovations. He converted Marquinhos from a centre-back into a holding midfield player with a decent amount of success. There were times last season when he had PSG playing in this sort of super attacking 4-2-4 formation. They referred to as the Quatre Fantastiques. You had Neymar, Mbappe, Di Maria, and then either Mauro Icardi or Cavani in that front line. And, for a brief period, that looked like a winning formula. But then, by the end of the season, and particularly the Champions League, PSG had become a much more conservative team. And I think their success in the Champions League owed more to sort of collective discipline and players putting in shifts for each other than any, particularly coherent tactical plan. So Tuchel's PSG ended up becoming a bit of a fudge as well. And you look at the last few weeks of his tenure, and he'd settled on this 5-3-2 system with Mbappe and Neymar as the two prongs of the attack. And that for me really symbolised the problems he had, in that you had this team that was basically split in half. You had a goalkeeper and 8 players whose job it was to stop goals going in. And you had Neymar and Mbappe whose job it was to score the goals. But there wasn't a great amount of cohesive tactical thought behind that, I didn't feel. And that's what Mauricio Pochettino now has to confront. Can he turn this group of very talented individuals into a winning team? And that's something that all of his predecessors as PSG coach in this modern era have grappled with. And it was ultimately something that Tuchel, I felt, never really got to grips with.
What makes Pochettino appealing to PSG, and why do they think that he might succeed where some of those previous managers that you just mentioned haven't?
Well, he's a former PSG player, first and foremost. He was there for 2.5 years between 2001 and 2003. So that gives him a certain legitimacy straight away. He was a former captain, and although he didn't win any trophies during his time there, he left a good impression. He's also, a stylish guy, a charismatic guy, a good-looking guy, someone who's good with the media. And I think that fits with the image that the club wants to project. And image is very important at PSG, as we mentioned earlier. But I think above all, he's a coach who is renowned for having a fierce work ethic and who makes his teams really horrible to play against. And PSG are a horrible team to play against because they're full of talented footballers, but they're not a horrible team to play against because they work hard, because they're in your face, because they press relentlessly the way that Pochettino's Tottenham did. And I think that is, more than anything else, what appealed to PSG's decision makers when it came to Pochettino. That thought that he could come in and instill the same sort of rigour and the same sort of attitude as he did at Tottenham with the superstar players in PSG's squad. And if he's successful in doing that, he will, or he should at least, succeed in taking PSG to the next level, which is winning the Champions League, which, as we all know, has been the number one objective for the club ever since the Qataris arrived in the summer of 2011.
You mentioned how Poch was a player there from 2001 until 2003. What was his time at the club like? You said he was a club captain.
Yeah, so, it wasn't a particularly successful period, but, personally, Pochettino created or left a very good impression. So he was there for 2.5 years. He played alongside some fantastic players. This was the era at PSG of JJ Okocha and Ronaldinho. Nicola Anelka was there for a season. Mikel Arteta was there as well. So there was a bit of the glamour around the club that there is now and that you always expect with PSG. So he arrives midway through the 2000-2001 season. The following season, he's a regular starter at centre-back, bringing the sort of rugged defensive qualities that he was always renowned for during his playing career. PSG finished fourth. They have the best defence in Liga that season. So, a positive impact on the pitch. He's named club captain in his second season, helps the club to reach the Coupe de France final, which unfortunately they lose. And then at the end of that second full season, the summer of 2003, he leaves. So, a bit of a transitional period for PSG. But I think if you look at the sort of the 10, 15-year period before the Qataris arrived, that was almost the most glamorous iteration of PSG that existed during that time because of the superstar players they had. And when you speak to modern day PSG players and, young French football players who were growing up in the late 90s and early noughties, many of them, watched that PSG team, watched Okocha and Ronaldinho and fell in love with that team. And it was a team that really marked young footballers in France and young football fans in France at that time. And Pochettino was a very important part of that team.
So there's still like a really, big connection between the fans and him because of that time, even now.
I mean, there should be. I mean, it was a while ago. He is arriving almost 20 years to the day since he first joined the club. So clearly a lot of water has passed beneath the bridge during that time. The club has changed almost beyond recognition. So, the PSG that he returns to is a very different PSG to the one that he left. But he knows the city, which is an advantage. I suspect he probably speaks at least a little bit of French, having been there as long as he was and having gone on to play for Bordeaux afterwards. And he was a popular player. So I think he will be popular with the fans. He left happy memories from his time there. And I think particularly as a link to PSG's pre-Qatar history, that gives him a certain authenticity. Because one thing that PSG fans get really annoyed about is when they're told that their club has no history. Of course, this is a very young football club. It celebrated its 50th anniversary only this year. But there was a PSG before the Qataris arrived in 2011. It was a PSG that won league titles, that reached European finals, that had spectacular players and achieved spectacular things on the pitch. And, modern day PSG fans do get annoyed when people only ever talk about PSG as if the club was brought into being in 2011. So having a coach who has, played for the club before that date and represents a part of that history himself, I think that will serve to endear him to the PSG supporters.
This past week, Jonathan Liu wrote a column about this hiring, and in the column, he questioned the appointment, and he said that, quote, "This is the most intriguing aspect to the appointment. Pochettino made his name as a team builder, a coach who demands humility and honesty and suffering, and who draws his squads tight like a family. What happens when he takes over a club that demands the exact opposite, where the individual is king, where all the forces spin outwards?" What do you make of those comments by Liu of, essentially he's going to a team full of individuals when he's a team builder?
Well, I think he hits the nail on the head in terms of why PSG wanted Pochettino. That has been PSG's problem throughout their modern era, is that they have consistently looked like a team of individuals. They've signed the best players in the world year after year, and they still haven't won the Champions League. It was only last season that they emerged as a team who even looked capable of winning the Champions League, and that with the caveat that we were in the middle of the pandemic, that the end of the tournament was in this novel format, the final eight in Lisbon, and also, and this is not to criticise PSG's achievement in reaching the final, but they didn't have to beat any of the sort of traditional big European heavyweight clubs in order to get there. So, they've tried throwing money at this team. They've tried just stuffing it full of superstar players, and that has brought them domestic dominance and, legitimacy in the Champions League. They are rightly seen as contenders for winning the Champions League and have been for a few years, but they want a coach who is going to build a team that really feels like it's the full sum of its constituent parts. And that's something that proved beyond Thomas Tuchel, I think, ultimately. So that's why Pochettino appeals. As I mentioned earlier, if he can make PSG play the way that Tottenham played during the high point of his time at Tottenham, with the same sort of intensity, the same energy, then, if you can get guys like Neymar and Mbappe and Di Maria and Marco Verratti and Mauro Icardi running and pressing the way that Harry Kane and Son Heung-min and Dele Alli and Christian Eriksen did, they should be unstoppable. And I think his appointment also ties in with something that Leonardo, the sporting director, spoke about last summer. He spoke about wanting PSG to be less bling-bling. I think there was a feeling that, there's huge glamour when it comes to Paris Saint-Germain. The fact that they are the club of the French capital and all the associations with fashion and culture that come along with that. The fact they've got these superstar players like Neymar, like Mbappe. But I think also there was a feeling that PSG need to go back to basics on the pitch a little bit. And Pochettino, in theory, should be the perfect coach for that.
Now, at Tottenham, Pochettino was famous for his 4-2-3-1 formation. Do you see that working with PSG's personnel, or do you think he's going to have to try a different system?
I mean, in some respects, it would seem like a natural fit in that one thing, PSG have this surfeit of creative attacking players. So if you imagine that the attacking midfield band in a 4-2-3-1, you could have Mbappe on the left, Neymar at number 10, Di Maria on the right with either Icardi or Moise Kean in attack. And then in midfield, you've got Marco Verratti, and then a choice from Leandro Paredes, Idrissa Gueye, Rafinha, Ander Herrera, Danilo Pereira. But that will only work if Neymar and Mbappe in particular, and Icardi as well, and Di Maria, put a shift in. This was something that Tuchel struggled to get to grips with. He wanted to put those four in his team at every available opportunity. But when it came to the crunch, he found that he felt more secure playing with a midfield three. And consequently, I mean, you look back to the final stages of the Champions League last season, PSG went into a lot of those matches with a three-man midfield. So that's what Pochettino is going to have to grapple with. Can he get his attacking players to work hard enough for a 4-2-3-1 or a 4-4-2 system to work? And if not, will he have to, revert to a 4-3-3, put in another central midfielder and take one of those attacking players out of the attack? I think he will want to see whether it is feasible to play in that kind of shape with four predominantly attacking players, whether he can get the buy-in from them in terms of the defensive implication that's needed for that to work. And if he can't, then he'll have to look for alternatives.
Currently, PSG is in third place, but they're still the favorite for the title, only 1 point back of Lille and Lyon. Do you think this improves their chances of winning the title this year, or does this decrease their chances of winning the title this year and giving Lyon and Lille a slightly better opportunity?
It's hard to say, really. I guess it will depend on how quickly Pochettino can, find a system that suits him and can kind of get the players on board. I mean, PSG are still favourites for the title. They've still got, comfortably the best squad in the country. They've got 6, 7, 8 players maybe who would walk into any other team in Liga. I mean, it's exciting that we look like we've got a proper title race for once. Lille have been really impressive so far this season. Lyon as well, who've hit this great run of form since sort of mid-October, and Rudy Garcia switching to this new 4-3-3 setup. And they also have the experience, Lyon, of having reached the Champions League semi-finals last year, and I think that's given them something to fall back on. So, and Marseille are not out of the picture either. I mean, they stuttered a little bit as we approach the winter break, but they've still got a couple of games in hand. And if they win both of those, they'll be in the title mix as well. So it does feel like PSG will have a fight on their hands this season. I suspect that if Pochettino can find a system that works quickly, then he should be able to hit the ground running. But there will be a question mark about that until we see, what his PSG look like on the pitch.
So do you think this ends well for Pochettino, or do you think that he'll go along the same lines of Tuchel, Emery, Ancelotti, and Blanc?
I think it will depend on whether he can bond with his players, whether he can get buy-in from his players, whether the likes of Neymar and Mbappe and Di Maria and the rest of them will listen to him as attentively as the players he worked with at Tottenham did. If he can turn PSG into a war machine like he did with Tottenham, and I remember, going to watch Spurs when they were still at the old White Hart Lane during the high point of the Pochettino era, and it was such a treat because you knew that you would always get, intensity and, an enormous amount of energy from that team, on top of the fact that they had all these supremely talented individuals. And that's what turned Spurs into such a successful team during that period. And that is what Pochettino must try to achieve at PSG. If he can get PSG's players to buy into that and to press in the way that Tottenham's players did, assuming that that's the approach that he takes, then I think he will have great success. And I think he, again, we're talking hypotheticals, but, if you can inject the current PSG team as it is now with that sort of attitude, that sort of work rate and industry and hunger, they should be unstoppable. Now, the danger is if he can't get the players to buy in that way. And, as we discussed previously, Unai Emery wanted his players to work harder for him. Thomas Tuchel wanted his players to work harder for him. And both of those coaches only had mixed success, ended up compromising. Pochettino may have to compromise as well. So the challenge then will be, can he find a compromise that proves successful in a way that Emery and Tuchel couldn't? So it makes perfect sense in all manner of different ways. The fact he's an ex-PSG player, the fact he's an Argentinian, that gives him a connection to the South American players in the PSG changing room. The fact that he's got this reputation for wringing out every last ounce of potential from his teams. You add that to this supremely talented collection of PSG players, and it could be a sensation. And, personally really excited by the prospect of seeing what Pochettino's PSG look like and seeing whether he can be the coach who finally gets them over the line in the Champions League. So yeah, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Tom Williams is a football writer and broadcaster who contributes to The Times, Canal Plus, and The Totally Football Show. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about those songs in the episode show notes. This episode was produced by myself and John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today.